YouTube. Welcome to what is, I suppose, part 7 of the Book of Five Rings review. We're going to up the frequency on the literature review, so there's going to be an episode every single Tuesday because the Agakure that I'm starting to write scripts about and I'm starting to analyze more and more is going to take us a lot of episodes, and there are other books that I'm excited to get to. I want to talk about Stoicism, I want to discuss Nietzsche. There are many things I want to get to, and because I analyze the books in such details, it takes some time, right? So I don't want to have to wait 2022 to get to certain books, so it's going to be a weekly installment for the time being. So the last time in the Book of Five Rings, we discussed injecting your spirit into things. We discussed crossing at a ford, all of those notions that Musashi shared with us. And now we're going to keep going, and we're still in the fire book, we're still discussing strategies. So I am still skipping a lot of things that if you buy the book yourself and you write and you read, you will discover. I'm not spoiling them for you, but they are not relevant enough in terms of fitness and self-development for me to discuss here. So we're going to go straight into the next page, where Musashi starts by saying, "The voice is a thing of life. We shout against fires and so on, against the wind and the waves. The voice shows energy." There is something called a kiai in martial arts, where in certain sports it's more of a ceremonious way of announcing you're going to attack. In other sports it is codified as a shout, a primal shout that you use to expend your energy, for example in karate. And in other sports like MMA, for example, it's not really in the culture, but you see fighters doing it all the time, where they will shout to intimidate their opponents or to share their excitement. So it's something that people do even if they don't really practice it. And your voice, of course, expresses who you are. We tend to trust people based on their words, but we don't really realize that the way the words are being pronounced, the tone of the voice, how high or low the voice is, all of those things give us good indications about the state of mind of the person and whether or not we're going to actually put our trust in them. You can also tell if someone is scared based on their voice, if they're feeling confident or not, if they're lying to you. All of those things are carried by this thing that we call language, but more importantly by the platform of the language, which is your physical voice, right? It's the vibration of the air that produces the sounds that we codified into a language so that it carries meaning. We shout against fires and so on. We shout against the wind, against the waves. Why would you shout against those things? Those are elemental beings, right? It's fire. Why would it have an influence? Well, you could believe that you are projecting your energy towards something that is basically pure energy, right? Fire consumes things, uses their energy to produce heat, and then when there is no more energy to use, it disappears. Water is just a mass of matter moving around because of its energy. It's the same for the wind. We cannot see the wind, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and the wind can knock you down. It has an energy of its own. So you can think that the energy that your voice produces is going to have an impact on those things. But the most straightforward and down-to-earth understanding of this is you shout and you motivate yourself as you shout. And by doing this, you reinforce yourself and your being so that you can fight these things. As far as fires go, I'm not sure if Musashi actually trained using certain types of fire methods, but I do know that it was, and it still is, quite common for people who live near the beach to go in the water and just fight the waves. If you live near a waterfall, you can go underneath the waterfall too. It strengthens the body and the mind, especially if the water is very cold. Against the wind, that would be more contextual, I guess, because you cannot always expect strong winds to train against. But if you've ever biked, the difference between having the wind in your back or in front of you is light and day. It feels like you're carrying a backpack with weights in it when the wind is blowing in your face and you're biking. So that's what you basically do. You reinforce yourself with a shout. And you're going to find, if you've ever done that in sports and in lifting, for example, if you're in the middle of a very tough set and you're in an environment that allows you to shout and really go at it and shout, not just whimper, the rest of the set is going to be easy because the shout is going to reinvigorate yourself, right? You're motivating yourself just by hearing the strength in your voice. I've also found that if you mess up and you go too timid and you don't really shout as much as you could, it can have the opposite effect and it can psych you out. He finishes by saying that the voice shows energy in life. Of course, if you have a presentation to do at your job or if you introduce yourself to people, if you're trying to make a good impression, your voice is going to carry your spirit. And as I said in the start of this paragraph, it's super important because as humans, you could argue that there's a biological aspect of that where men are going to respect guys with lower voices, and you could say that it's because it's a sign of high test. But there's also the fact that culturally speaking, we develop certain capacities to understand people in social environments, and so we're really good at reading people and the sound of their voice. Right afterwards, and with no, there is no, I forgot the term of that, but right after that paragraph with no introduction, he says, in large-scale strategy, at the start of battle, we shout as loudly as possible. During the fight, the voice is low-pitched, shouting out as we attack. After the contest, we shout in the wake of our victory. These are the three shouts. So you shout at the start to psych yourself up and to scare the enemy. During the fight, the voice is low-pitched and you shout only as you attack. After it, you shout because you are the victor. So if you were to compare that to, for example, lifting and a set, before the set, you scream to hype yourself up. After each rep, you scream, and then when you're done, you scream again. If you go to a commercial gym, they will kick you out for doing that. If you have your home gym, you will be able to do that as much as you want. Pay attention to the fact that screaming takes energy, and I'm not just talking about calories. It is also, in my opinion, something that is tiring mentally. It takes some mental stamina. And it also, because it boosts your adrenaline levels, it is something that can lead to you feeling depleted, sort of like it would if one were to drink too much coffee. So pay attention to that. Don't abuse the shouts, only use them when necessary. Of course, when you are in a situation of life and death like a battle, you're not going to think about things like this, because who cares about being depleted mentally as long as you survive, right? The mountain sea change. This one is very interesting. The mountain sea spirit means that it is bad to repeat the same thing several times when fighting the enemy. There may be no help but to do something twice, but do not try it a third time. If you once make an attack and fail, there is little chance of succeeding if you use the same approach again. If you attempt a technique which you have previously tried unsuccessfully and yet fail, then you must change your attack method. Just the name mountain sea is interesting because depending on the country you live in, of course, most of the time the environment in which a mountain can exist is directly opposed to where the sea can exist. So there is no such thing as the mountain sea. It shows that there is a discrepancy here, but depending on the culture you grew up in and the country you grew up in, certain countries like Japan, because it's an archipelago, they do have mountains very close to the sea. It's a rare sight, but it's one of my favorite things in the world, where you are in the water, in the sea, or in an ocean, and you can look out and you can see mountains, like actual tall mountains from where you are. It's an incredible feeling. And the way to apply it to lifting, as long as the mountain sea spirit goes, is that most likely a method that leads to plateaus or who leads to injuries once is very likely to repeat itself. The chance that it was just a fluke is low. But Musashi still tells you that you can give it a second try. But if the second try still doesn't work or reproduces the bad results of the first try, do something else. There is no reason to continue doing that. You can apply it to rep ranges. If a rep range doesn't work, I know a lot of people are going to tell you that it's not the rep range, it's you, and they always like to put the blame on the lifter and not the lifting methods. I'm going to assume if you're on this channel that you are serious about lifting, that you understand recovery, and that in that case, most likely it's the methodology that you're applying that is failing you. Because there are so many variables when it comes to rep ranges, volume, intensity, that chances are you just struck a certain percentage that just does not work, and where progress is not going to be actually produced. So you should change. You tried the mountain, now try the sea. And based on that name, also keep in mind, there's no such thing as one mountain and there's no such thing as one sea. Every sea is different. And even a given sea, depending on the time of the day, depending on the climate, is going to be a different sea. It's a completely different environment. For me, this shows that the mountain seas reality should be called the 1,000 mountains and the 1,000 seas. There's always a new thing to try. The issue with this would also to always try new things when things don't work, where you should try and apply yourself a little bit to not end up just being in constant rotations and making no progress. Which is why the advice of Musashi to actually try something twice before you give up is very good. I like this one a lot. Just the name is interesting, and the image that it invokes in your mind. Rat's head, ox's neck. Rat's head and ox's neck means that we must always think of the way of strategy as being both a rat's head and an ox's neck. Whenever we have become preoccupied with small details, we must suddenly change into a large spirit, interchanging large with small. So if you can picture in your head, what would a rat's head look on an ox's neck? It would look strange, and you would have the small detail first, and then you have that big neck. And it can become difficult to not lose sight of one or the other, because if you just pay attention to the head, then the neck just becomes a background that gets lost. And if you pay attention to the neck, the small head that is on the neck is now just a small detail. It's something that is repeated in the book always and always. The difference between small things and big things, the small picture and the big picture, there is no such thing. These things are created by your subjective biases. You can actively change your point of view so that something that is small becomes big and vice versa. I explained that in the past, but I think that the rat's head and the ox's neck give a very good idea of a metaphor you can picture in your head to make that clearer. So when you're preoccupied with the small detail, try and look at the small detail as part of the big picture so that you attain the large spirit and vice versa. Musashi says there are various kinds of spirit involved in letting go of the hilt, in the strategy called Let Go of the Hilt. There is the spirit of winning without a sword. There is also the spirit of holding the long sword but not winning. The various methods cannot be expressed in writing. You must train well. Very obscure, very cryptic again. What does that mean? What is to let go of the hilt? And what is winning without a sword? For me, it's the idea that just because you have a sword does not mean that the sword can become the tool of victory. And just because you don't have a soul doesn't mean that your body cannot now become the tool of victory. For us bodybuilders, it means to me that you need to let go of the potential accessories and outside things that you develop your body with, in the sense that just if they were not to exist, you would still retain the ability to move the body and to develop the body. And just because they exist does not mean that you have the ability to develop the body. Just because you have a squat rack and a bar doesn't mean that you now have the means to develop your legs. Just because you don't have a squat rack and a bar doesn't mean that you lose the ability to develop the legs. This development and the constant challenge and the constant quest towards size and just muscular and spiritual development is within you. Things outside of you can be used, but even if they're not there, the spirit is still in you. It's not in the things. And that is something that, on a broader term, can be applied to the idea of minimalism, which rejects the idea of materialism. The things you buy are not extensions of your spirit, but they can become it. And then after that, it's what people tell all the time, things that you own end up owning you. You lose sight of what it means to own things. You own things not because you need them, not because if they disappear, you wouldn't be whole anymore, but to make use of them. They are tools. And we're going to finish the chapter, I think. Another strategy or technique is called the body of a rock. When you have mastered the way of strategy, you can suddenly make your body like a rock, and 10,000 things cannot touch you. This is the body of a rock. You will not be moved. Oral tradition. Okay. Is it possible to turn your body into a rock? You could argue that bodybuilding, by reducing your body fat percentage and building muscle mass, which is just tougher to the touch, is going to make you more like a rock. Can you develop legs and a core so strong that nothing can move you? You can do it to a point where things that would knock most people out of balance wouldn't knock you, because you're going to be so heavy and so stable that you're going to be very tough to knock out of balance. We spoke about that in last episode too. The balance is also something that can be applied to the spirit. Your spirit has a balance. And it's my opinion that a strong body goes hand in hand with a strong mind, and vice versa. So if you achieve a body that has a strong balance, your spirit is going to be more balanced, and the opposite is also true. But here Musashi says that you can suddenly make your body like a rock. So in terms of bodybuilding, it would be flexing. When you flex, your body suddenly becomes much harder. But how much harder does it actually become? You don't actually become a rock. And a rock is much heavier than you, and because of the way a rock is shaped, most people don't realize that. The reason why it's so tough to move a rock is because of the fact that a rock, by definition, is something that has a large base. Why? Because it's a piece of a mountain, basically. It's rock. But if the base was smaller than the top, the rock would just capsize until it ends up in a place where its center of gravity is where it's the toughest to move. So when the base is large, this is why moving a rock is tough. Most rocks are not as heavy as you think. They're just very cumbersome. But for us, we don't have the ability to do that. For a human, the best we could do is just to lay flat on the ground so that we have more surface area and we're very tough to move. But I don't really see the point of doing that. So that's why, in my opinion, what Musashi says here is more in a spiritual manner, that you can make yourself like a rock and 10,000 things cannot touch you. This is the body of a rock. Because as I said, Musashi sort of applies the same logic I have, which I got from him, to be honest, where the strength of the body and the spirit are correlated. And if you get sick, your spirit gets sick, and vice versa. So you can actually have an influence on both if you can master both. So with a very strong trained body comes a very strong trained mind that is going to be like a rock, and things cannot touch you. You will not be moved. You will not be moved is sort of like a mantra. it doesn't mean to be inflexible or intolerant, but it does mean that you get to decide if you move, and you also have the ability to not let yourself be influenced. Because when you say someone moved us, what it really means is they injected their emotions or the emotions they wanted us to feel into something. It can be a gorgeous piece of classical music that is moving you to tears. That's a good way to be moved. But you can also be moved by certain people who are malicious, who are going to use your emotions to manipulate you the way they want. If you have a spirit like a rock, you will be able to decide if you want to be moved or not, because you told yourself, I will not be moved. He precises oral tradition because I think there is more to that. The transformation of the body like a chunk of rock is something that is can be found in a lot of martial arts, especially from the Far East. And we have 2 techniques left in the firebox that I think are interesting. Oh no, actually it's the conclusion of the book. This book, Musashi says, is a spiritual guide for the man who wishes to learn the way. He says that my heart has been inclined to the way of strategy from my youth onwards. I have devoted myself to training my hand, tempering my body, and attaining the many spiritual attitudes of sword fencing. If we watch men of other schools discussing theory and concentrating on techniques with the hands, even though they seem skillful to watch, they have not the slightest true spirit. So here it's sort of an explanation of the fire book, why he wrote it. He says he started thinking about things like this ever since he was a kid, ever since he started fighting. And it's something that I think everyone can relate, but not everyone can fully reflect on. Because for me, for example, I've been lifting for 10 years. It took me a long time to finally try and conceptualize and intellectualize all of the concepts that I was applying every day in my training. And I think when Musashi talks about other schools who are very skillful but don't have the true spirit, he refers to people who do the opposite. People who, for the most part, got knowledge from someone else, but never really applied it. So they took the way, but in reverse. Instead of practicing, getting first-hand experience, and then letting that mature, and then sharing it with people, they started by having a mature spirit injected into them when they don't have the level to practice it yet. And that is going to be detrimental for your gains, and it's going to be detrimental for your spirit. It can make one very smug and arrogant because you were gifted a spiritual gift that you're not able to handle right now. Of course, he says, men who study in this way think they are training the body and spirit, but it is an obstacle to the true way, and its bad influences remain forever. Thus, the true way of strategy is becoming decadent and dying out. He doesn't really explain the depth of what he's mentioning here, so I'm not going to say that, but I'm going to mention one thing he says here. He says that the influence of that misguided way is a bad influence forever. And I think it's a very smart way to apprehend life, because the influence of your first times are sometimes unshakable. Your childhood, the first experiences you've had with certain things are going to mold you, and for a lot of people, they will never be able to break from that, because they're always going to be attached to that first experience, and that first experience dictates the 99 other experiences that they have afterwards, which is why Musashi laments that so many young men are being misguided, because once they're misguided, you cannot get them back. You cannot save them from themselves. It is an idea that was developed also during the Cold War and the psychological warfare that the multiple countries involved played on each other. And a lot of the Soviets, for example, found that if you can manage to manipulate the mindset of very young kids or even young adults once you have implanted in their mind your spirit and injected them with your beliefs, it's too late. No amount of proof, no amount of first-hand experience is going to convince them otherwise. They are contaminated. And for the most part, it's too late for them. So this is sort of that idea that it's sort of the conclusion on what he said about injecting your spirit. And for me, what I get from that is, you see the book being very vague. Musashi doesn't tell you, hey, this is how you think. He gives you keys of comprehension. For me, this is how you build a very strong mind that is your own and that is integrate to your body too. You discover it. This is why, for me, people should try what they want, and they should make the mistakes that they have to make. There is no point in studying 1,000 books to make no mistakes, because by doing that, you made the fatal mistake of what Musashi describes here, which is not putting the training at the center of your life and opening up yourself to bad influences and missing the true way of strategy. And we're going to end here, because next week is the Book of the Wind, and this Book of the Wind is the very last book until the Book of the Void, which is my favorite one, which we should get to around part 10, and then we'll move to the Agakure. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.